I suppose, therefore, has the pace of work been affected by home working? So the notion of this presenteeism, where we're potentially sitting at our laptops a lot more than we would otherwise be sitting at our desks in our office. So has the pace of what we're doing been affected by that? Abigail, will just maybe ask you to continue that.
The pace of work has been affected massively. If you start off with the beginning of the working day, people are not commuting, so they're not having that natural barrier, the natural boundary between home and work. And whilst many people miss the commute, a lot of people missed that time between the two to enable to sort of recalibrate from one to the other at both ends of the day. Other factors are, as I said, you in a normal, not normal, in a workplace scenario where you're in the office, you would never schedule 3-hour meetings back to back, because the physical practicality of doing it is different, because you'd have to move between rooms. And when you're in the meeting, you'd also, chat to the person sitting next to you. You'd probably use your face to express how you're feeling with other people in the room. There'd be a debrief with, close colleagues afterwards. That is all about the ebb and flow of the working day. It's about changing pace. We don't have that change of pace, and many of our participants have talked about sitting in front of the computer with a sandwich, during, not actually having proper lunch breaks. And whilst that is often the case in an office scenario, at least you would probably have to walk to a cafe to buy your sandwich. Now it's, quickly make a sandwich, go back to your next meeting. So there's a real problem with being on the whole time and really not having any pacing or any change in ebb and flow.
Thanks very much. Michelle, would you have anything to add there? Thanks.
No, I would just agree with that. And I think, the point I was making before about making sure you have adequate breaks during the day, as well, as something probably that people don't schedule in for themselves. And you might not do that normally when you're in the workplace, but you do have those other things that distract you and pull you away from your work that have that ebb and flow, as Abigail has said. So I think that really does have an impact on how people manage their working day. I think the other thing is the importance of boundaries between work and home life. So I think people find it very difficult to draw those boundaries between being at home and being at work. And the other thing I was thinking of was the idea of, being on annual leave or something like that. There, your employer knows that you're still at home, so there is no separation between the working day and other life, because where else are you going to be? You can go to that meeting. You can do something at the weekend for work, because there is actually nothing else that you can do, or at least there is for employees. And for some employees, there'll be that perception of, well, I've got nothing better to do, so why can't I go to that meeting, that training course? Oh yeah, technically I'm on annual leave, but they know I'm not anywhere, so why shouldn't I do that? So I think there's that. And it's probably an unconscious pressure. It's maybe pressure that individuals put on themselves rather than employers, but it is present, I think, when you feel as if you have to be available all the time, because you can be. And I think that's a difficulty too.
And I think that's a good point to make, and it's specifically a time that we're in at the moment when we actually you can't physically go anywhere anyway. It's whether that attitude might change, where it is happening. It's whether that changes when we are allowed more freedom to go further than our own front door at the moment, as to whether that notion of you're always there, even when you're on annual leave and you're still contactable, will still be there. So it'll be interesting to see how that kind of develops as well. And I suppose just following on from that is that thinking about this kind of notion of the pace of work and the distinction that we had before between the office environment and the home environment. And we mentioned it earlier, I think we touched on it around kind of conversations just around about the outcomes rather than the time. I suppose I would be interested to get your thoughts.
Well, I think it's about setting really clear deadlines for things or tasks that have to be achieved, rather than expecting people to work for X amount of hours in a day. And that represents an idea of effective working, and this kind of idea of a sort of presenteeism. And we know that people tend to be present because they think it makes them look much more as if they're contributing much more to the office environment, when actually they're not necessarily being more productive than someone who's not always present in the office environment too. So it's maybe learning from that and actually being more task orientated rather than time bound in terms of how we expect people to do things. Because quite often people will say that a task takes as long as you've got to do it. And so if we sort of think about things in that kind of way and try and set achievable targets and goals for people, be they in a daily or a weekly or monthly basis, however long it needs for the process or task to be completed, and focus on that rather than this idea of presenteeism or what have you, because equally someone could be present in an online meeting but actually not at all engaged in it either, and it's just that perception that they're involved too. So I think actually looking at output and focusing on that is much more effective. But also the other side of that is having trust from your manager and support from your manager so that you can actually do that job effectively within the time frame that you've got to do it. If you don't have the right equipment to do that job, or you don't have the right support, then you're not going to be able to do it anyway. So having that communication, as well as Abigail said before, that's really important to here to make sure that people actually can be as productive as possible.
Okay, thank you. Hand over to you, Abigail.
What we have found at the moment is actually work has been great for centering people, distracting people from the pandemic. So I think a lot of people that I have spoken to have said without work, they would be lost. However, what you have is for those people that are working, they are working harder than ever, because not are they only having to do their day jobs, they're having to do it in an environment that's unfamiliar and probably less helpful than the office environment. They're having to mitigate all the COVID related factors that impact on everybody's work. And often they're having to undertake additional work because of colleagues that have been furloughed or any redundancies. So people are exhausted. So they're exhausted because they've got a faster pace of work, which is being made worse by all the factors I've just discussed. There's an interesting thing about how work is changing how we feel about home. So as somebody who I used to work at home a couple of days a week, and for me that was a luxury. That was my space where I could think. I was productive, but it was a different mindset. Now that luxury of home working, where you do your really creative work, has gone. But for many people who don't have a dedicated work room, then their home has been invaded by work. And in some ways that is not just the physical, but that's the digital as well. So a lot of employers haven't been able to provide computers and other IT equipment. So in a sense, your own personal computer, the item that you use for leisure, for communicating with friends and family, has also been invaded by work. So there has been a really interesting invasion of the home by work, both in terms of physical and digital.
And I suppose in that, there's, the one thing that's come through is that specifically if you're talking about setting tasks or the kind of the distinction between work and what was the home and the office, etc., is bearing in mind the conversation we were talking about earlier about opportunities and access. Is we just need to think about employees' individual circumstances when we come to plan that out. So there could be a notion that they've got caring responsibilities, so we need to think of that when we're looking at tasks and deadlines, or potentially the setup they have in their home to be able to do it effectively, the support's there. So I guess that's something that comes into the mix there. So just in summary, just as we close the discussion, just to kind of open up to you both in terms of whether there's kind of any kind of final points that you would want to make on this, or whether there was any kind of things that we've discussed that you would particularly want to highlight as we look to finish. Michelle, I'll maybe ask you first.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that sort of resonates most with me is that when we're thinking about working from home in the pandemic, we do have to remember that it's a completely different environment from working from home ordinarily. As Abigail says, I also worked from home a couple of days a week, and that was my time for thinking, and it's a completely different scenario now. when you're thinking about all the other pressures that are going on as well. So I think employers really have to be mindful of that and don't make any changes that are solely based on the experiences of working during a pandemic from home. There are a lot of benefits, but there are a lot of challenges from working from home, and all of those are individual. And all of these kind of things have to be taken into account when making any decisions about the future for or of home working for all employees as well. So I would just say be mindful of all of that.
Thank you very much. And Abigail, any closing remarks from yourself?
I would agree with everything Michelle said. This is an exceptional scenario. It's not the norm. But what we can take from that is that it has demonstrated that working from home is possible. I think I would like us to think more about people's mental health. At the moment, from the people I've spoken to in terms of my research, we're facing a mental health crisis. People are really struggling, both with home working and having to balance all the other requirements from their life. And I think employers really, really need to take much more responsibility for the psychological well-being of employees. Interestingly, in terms of equality and opportunities, particularly for women, the pandemic home working scenario has been massively disadvantageous to women. They are less likely than men to have a dedicated home working space. They still take on the vast majority of the caring responsibilities and domestic responsibilities in the household. And at the end of the worst point of the pandemic, I think if you ask people to measure outputs, women are going to be disadvantaged. And it worries me that this has set back any equality agenda a decade or two. I think that is different going forwards. I think home working will provide opportunities, but I think in this particular pandemic scenario, I think we really, really have to be careful and look and see how women have fared.
Thank you very much, Abigail. That was a good point to finish on. So I just want to say thank you very much for participating in the conversation today. Thanks to Michelle and to Abigail, and thank you. Cheerio.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.